Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining me today. And thank you for the introduction. And with that, we will just start rolling. And we always start with a declaration of conflicts. I don't really have any true conflicts to share with y'all. Just start off by saying, hey, I love our profession. I love people. And I've been blessed to be part of the EMS and fire service family for nearly 30 years now. As mentioned, I am the Director of Education for Platinum Educational Group, but I am speaking on my own behalf, and my thoughts may not reflect the thoughts and opinions of the company or its ownership, although I'm pretty sure they do. And I also want to thank NAEMSE for hosting the webinar and allowing me the opportunity to share my thoughts and ideas, which again are my own. I am a proud member of the organization, but I'm not speaking on their behalf today. Yes, you see that handsome little guy in the lower left-hand corner, that's Thunder. So I believe we are shaped by our experiences, and that includes our education. I am an alumni of Grand Canyon University. That's where I completed my bachelor's in health science, as well as a master's in business administration and a master of science and leadership. It's not really a conflict, but I believe it's worth sharing. My master's program, especially the leadership one, was heavily focused on servant leadership, which lends itself well to topics like the one we're going to talk about today. And it seems that the more I learn, the more I realize how little I actually know. And the more I learn, the more my eyes are open to issues and things going on around us, which makes me want to learn more and do something about the issues by sharing what I've learned, which leads me to do presentations such as this one. So the motivation for this topic is that I chose to revisit this topic and to do this presentation because I believe there still are forces at play in our industry that are damaging our profession or harming our profession, eroding public trust, and causing internal strife and struggles within the profession itself. I've already told you that I love the profession and I love people, and so it breaks my heart to see the erosion of public trust and the breakdown of the affectual integrity of our industry. I think that we as a profession can be a lot better tomorrow than we are today, and that really is the big chunk of the motivation on why I choose to talk about topics such as the effects of our providers. I also believe that as EMS educators, we're positioned to address these issues in our initial education programs, as well as in continuing education. I also believe we have an obligation to do our part to address these issues. And ultimately, I want to plant a seed. And I want to raise awareness, and I want to start conversations in my hope. I remain prayerfully hopeful that someone will be encouraged to look at where they can reach out and have an impact too. I'm not the expert. I don't have all the answers, but I believe that by having conversations and raising awareness, that the solution's there to be found, and it's going to be found by those of us that are willing to have these conversations and to look around and see where we can be an agent of change. So I first presented on this topic 2.5 years ago, maybe 3 years ago now. We kind of lost a whole year-ish in there where things kind of blend together. But I believe it's still important, and I believe we need to continue the conversation because I believe we're in the middle of the perfect storm for our industry. Our provider agencies are begging for more providers. And as educators, we're being asked to produce more candidates in shorter and shorter timeframes. In the fire service, we're taught that the solution to pollution is dilution. though I believe we are in danger of dilution becoming our pollution as we face continued pressure to increase production. We need to remember that we're not manufacturing widgets. We cannot simply increase production to meet the current demand. Our job is to prepare confident, caring, compassionate, and competent candidates to enter a service industry where providers have access to people in their homes in the most desperate times. To prepare these candidates to enter a trusted profession with core values such as honesty, integrity, empathy, and compassion. So you see, it's not as simple as simply ramping up production to meet demand. We have to ensure the quality of our product, our students that we're preparing, or the continuing education that we're providing. And we must do so to protect our communities and our profession. I just want to remind everyone that our prime directive has not changed. Primum non nocere is still our prime directive, which is, of course, first, do no harm. Now, I do believe that there are conversations being had, and there's some good conversations being had. And if you were fortunate enough to attend symposium this year, there were some great sessions on topics like this. And I'm encouraged that we are having the conversations, and that there's research being done and there's attention being drawn to raise awareness. So what are we going to talk about? Well, we're going to talk about that kind of stuff. So I'm going to provide you with some real life examples of what I'm talking about. Examples that I think demonstrate breakdown of the affectual integrity in EMS, which means we need to chat a little bit about the affective domain, chat about bias, and then talk about some steps that we as EMS educators can take to address these issues. And then not just within our educational realm, not just within our classrooms or our initial education sessions, but what can we do as EMS educators to help advance professionalism beyond our classroom? So I suggest that the EMS profession as a whole, I believe we become comfortable. I think we've become comfortable knowing that there are some bad eggs out there among us, and we've become comfortable seeing and hearing the stories about our peers and colleagues demonstrating a lack of integrity. Some of us may have even become comfortable with justifying or making excuses for these behaviors. You know, it's just our dark humor. Yeah, it's an EMS thing, you wouldn't understand. Or, you know, it's just how we cope. They don't mean anything, it's just how we cope. But when did we decide it was better to turn a blind eye and wait for someone else to come along and police the industry for us? When did we decide to give up our voice and our own responsibility to police our industry from within? Before we go too much further, I think it's also important that we take a moment and recognize that we all have a past, and that past comes with us. I was not always as focused on or as dedicated to the affective domain as I am today. There are certainly times in my past where I have not been the best provider, the best leader, or the best educator, but that was who I was then and not who I am now. And so I think that's always a challenge when we present on topics like this, that we run into people from our past that remember where we were then, not necessarily where we're at today. So it's important that we remember that our past, though it may define the pathway that led us to where we're at today, it does not define or confine our future. And that's the beauty of it. We can change and become examples for those around us and become agents of change for the future of our profession. So a little over 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, these were some of the examples that I used when I first started talking about these issues that I believe are popping up that demonstrate that there are some issues within the profession. And I didn't want to reuse the same examples. Those same examples still pull up on Google searches and you can still find them, but it didn't take much investigative work on my part to find newer stories or social media posts and to see that things really have not improved much since I began talking about this a little over 2 years ago. And if we pay attention to our professional journals, national and local news, and to social media, we see that we continue to have our peers and colleagues out there performing stupid human tricks that are having a negative impact on our industry and eroding the public's trust. So let's just look at some different examples this time. So I'm submitting this evidence to y'all as a jury of my peers. Here's just some real world examples that I found that demonstrate what I'm talking about, some things that are troubling me. And as we review these and chat about them briefly, I want to make sure that we keep the focus where the focus is meant to be for this session today. And that is not on the individuals that pop up in these stories. Yes, they're bad actors, they're bad eggs, and the actions that they performed in and of itself is bad. And certainly should be addressed as such. But I also want us to kind of zoom out, okay, and see from change our lenses and look at these stories from the public's perspective, from those considering joining our profession to brand new students or brand new providers that are seeing these headlines. If we look at it like that, then that can help us have a more broad understanding of its impact on the industry. So this one, just in a nutshell, a paramedic admits to sexually assaulting patients and kids during hospital transports. So these events took place in the back of the ambulance. And so this dude was in the back of the ambulance doing this bad stuff, which meant there was someone in the front of the ambulance driving. But in reading the story, the drivers all denied any knowledge of what was going on in the back of the bus. And so there was no intervention on their behalf. And so this is all in the story. And so this story broke, it's out of Mississippi. So it made local news in Mississippi. And then, of course, the larger providers pick it up and it goes out across the World Wide Web for everyone to see. And so this one particular one was picked up by MSN. And so when someone from the general public reads this headline, they don't look at it as the individual. This is a bad dude doing bad things. They see paramedic, right? Paramedic is doing bad stuff in the back of the ambulance. Who are we supposed to call when we don't know who to call, when we're having the worst possible day of our lives? We call 911 and who shows up? Well, EMS shows up. Well, this is happening. And so they, the general public, look at it and it erodes trust. People looking to join the industry may see a headline such as this and say, I don't know that I want to be a part of all this. Or new providers are coming out going, what the heck is going on in the profession? So, I mean, there's headlines such as that, right? Exhibit A. So how about Exhibit B? These Wonder Twins, again, paramedics. They took it a step further, so they weren't abusing people in the back of their bus. They were, hey, answering the call, responding to homes, doing the job. But then when they identified maybe this was a hospice patient or under home health care, and they had controlled substances there. They would work a cardiac arrest and then would literally call back to talk to the family or the spouse, pretending to be from the visiting nurse agency, and make arrangements for pickup and disposal of those dangerous controlled substances in your house. You don't want to leave those in your house. You don't want to be responsible for those. We're going to take them for you. And then one of them would show back up dressed as someone from that agency to collect those meds for personal use and for sale. So again, so what's the public see when they see this? Well, they see paramedics are stealing from dying patients. Not exactly a prime example of integrity. This individual was caught stealing drugs, and I think it's important that we use the correct terminology and call it what it is. This individual is accused of theft, and he was stealing medications. It's easy for us to fall into that. Well, we're supposed to refer to it as drug diversion because they were diverting drugs from where they were supposed to go. But hey, let's call it what it is. He was stealing. He was stealing fentanyl. He was stealing morphine. He was stealing ketamine. All potent medications, right, with a clear purpose. There is a clear purpose for their use in EMS, but he wasn't just stealing them. He was stealing the medication and replacing it with normal saline, and then replacing the vial. And so that now this medication that has a clear purpose, when it was being pulled and drawn up for use, the patient wasn't getting what the patient was supposed to be getting. They were getting normal saline. And so not only are we harming the industry, we're harming patients because they're not getting the correct medication for the right reason. Now, I will tell you, I did within the story, the thing that caught my eye the most was a comment that the district attorney made. And the district attorney said, it's bad enough there was theft, but that's not the most alarming piece of all this. The most alarming piece of all this, and I quote, she said, "We have someone who was in a position of trust, and he was supposed to be protecting these medications and using them in a proper way, and instead used those drugs for his own personal benefits, and that's alarming and concerning for the public." And I think she hit the nail on the head. So it's bad enough that a paramedic is stealing the meds, and for whatever reason, it's bad. But again, when the public sees it, they just see paramedic stealing. And people considering coming into our profession look at it and say, again, well, what's going on? And the younger providers, younger not necessarily in literal age, but in time in, our newer providers may be second guessing whether they want to stay in an industry where this is happening. Another example of an EMS provider charged with sexually assaulting patients in the back of the ambulance. Again, is this building up public trust? Hey, I'm going to get in the back of the ambulance with this individual. I would suggest probably not. And there's another example of paramedic stealing, this one specific of fentanyl, over 3 years, about 70 vials. Another example of theft. And this one's kind of a doozy. So this EMT is, after transporting the 79-year-old lady, he lifted her debit card. So he saw it in the purse and took it. And so the patient was in the hospital for a few days or several days. And after several days, she realized that her debit card was missing from her purse or her wallet or whatever. So she reports it, it's investigated, and then up pops, of course, they can tell by records where the card was used, and they find video surveillance that shows the CMT. at the corner liquor store, purchasing 2 bottles of champagne. So evidently he was celebrating his newly acquired card. But it wasn't just the champagne, because then the card was also used at a pizzeria, for some chicken wings, at B-Dubs, at a grocery store, and a laundromat. And so again, people call EMS because they're having literally the worst day of their life, and they need help. They need someone to provide care, and the people showing up are stealing from them. Sure, those of us in this profession and in the industry, we can make the argument that, they're pretty few and far between, but the public just sees it, and sees the headline and is drawing their conclusions from the headline. So if you live in New York City and this was the headline you saw, then you may second guess calling 911. So, but it's not just about headlines in the news, right? I mean, there's plenty. We literally could hold a weekend conference and just talk about all the stupid human tricks that our peers and colleagues out there are doing that are eroding public trust. But it's also social media, and the way it's being used, and the fact that people are powerful when they hide behind a keyboard. And so this one is from EMS1, and this is just, it's from the summer of 20, and it's just talking about some social media posts that landed some providers in hot water, and they end up losing their job. And the examples they use happen to revolve around the time period of the death of George Floyd and the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. And so they were talking about the individuals that were taking part in the protests. And if you remember back, you think back to that time, there was images of truck drivers driving through protesters as they tried to block streets. But anyway, we had there's some EMS providers that had posted on social media, one an EMT from the New York area that was just using derogatory racial terms to describe all the protesters, and ended up being terminated based on those posts, which I would argue is probably that's the right thing there. And his employer did speak up and say, hey, we're not going to support this type of stuff. And then there was another one from the same time frame from New Jersey, a volunteer EMT that on social media was talking about his interactions with some protesters, and then interacting with some people on the social media post itself. And he said, well, I told them I'd just shoot and then kneel on their neck, ha ha ha. Not a very sensitive statement to be being made, especially at that time. And then when someone was commenting on it, he responded back with, are you a Muslim? If so, enough said, terrorist. And so again, just demonstrating a lack of empathy and professionalism on social media. And so manage all sorts of groups on social media. And I follow many of them for professional reasons, making sure that our protected content and from our testing platform is not being posted publicly into Facebook and such. But you monitor some of these social media groups, and you can see some students asking questions after they've been out on a call, asking about, is that really how we treat people? And then you see the more salty, experienced providers commenting, man, it's really discouraging seeing the way some of us interact and talk about our patients and their situations. And so this is just from, there's a group out there called EMS Junkies, and this is not a knock on any of the groups. This is just one of the posts that I grabbed. And I grabbed this one because he was specifically talking about something that he sees or she sees frequently in their area. And it's talking about a disparity in care based on how the level of use in the system. And I grabbed this because it has the term frequent flyer in it, which many people consider to be harmless, but there is a negative connotation. So unless you're talking about my Delta miles, don't call me frequent flyer. And there's all sorts of euphemisms, high system users, or well-known to EMS. But ultimately, they're a patient, they're a person, right? They're a person first, and that person has whatever issue, complaint. But I grabbed this one because it specifically used frequent flyer and was talking about how they can be treated differently based on the number of times they use the system. And there's just 2 of the 10 comments that just provide the example of, I don't know that we're doing a good job taking care of these people that are frequent users of our services. But it's not just about posts and conversations, right? Because a picture is worth 1,000 words. And, you know, in and of itself, okay, it's a meme, it's a funny meme, but when it's posted out there publicly, man, the picture speaks 1,000 words, right? So whoever posted this, how do they feel when they're dealing with the homeless population? So we need to be careful with the humor we use and the terms we use and the stories we tell, because they carry more weight than we realize. So all this stuff, every example I've shared and any example you can think of, I'm positive you can tie back to a breach somewhere in our code of ethics. I don't know, maybe you wouldn't be as surprised as I was, but when I walk around talking to providers and some fellow educators about our code of ethics, not everyone knows we have a code of ethics. So I wonder how many EMS providers today are even aware that there is a code of ethics for the profession. I go back to my EMT program. It was the EMT oath, and we memorized it and recited it and took it. But as educators, we should be sharing this with our students. As continuing education educators, we should be reminding our providers of this code of ethics. And I think it's a great place for us to begin. And I'm not gonna read it to you, because certainly we're all intelligent individuals, and you can read the slide just as easy as I can. I'm just gonna call out bits and pieces, and I'm gonna go through the code of ethics because it's several slides, because it's a little lengthy. But I'm just gonna call out specific pieces as they relate to the stories that we reviewed here just a little bit ago. So the first one here just says, hey, this is our job. We provide transport to the sick and injured equitably, do no harm. So look back on those, think back on the examples I mentioned, think back on the examples that you know, that you've seen on social media or in practice or in headlines. And I bet you most of them violate the do no harm piece. Here's a biggie. So we need to provide our services. We need to do what we do without discriminating. And hey, there's disparity. And there's examples. You don't have to go digging very far to find them. But this piece of the code of ethics is being violated. Take care of the public. Yep. We should do that. Maintain confidence. Yeah. Fortunately, we're not hearing too many or very frequently stories about people taking pictures of their patients and posting them, because we did have those um, providers. There were somewhere down south along the East Coast somewhere that were involved in that selfie war, where they were taking selfies with their unconscious patients. That is a good example of violated patient confidence. Um, but it can be violated in other ways. Social media is huge, right? Um, it's all over social media. To make sure we're maintaining clinical excellence, upholding the standards of our profession, personal responsibility and accountability is important, and I think is an area that the profession's a little lax in. We need to be aware of and active with legislation and regulation affecting EMS federally and at the state and local levels, and to work with our partners in care. Break down the barriers so that we don't continue to run into the us versus them mentality between pre-hospital and in hospital. And then, man, don't do anything unethical. So a pretty straightforward code of ethics, and really short compared to code of ethics of others. But what's happened? What's going on? I don't know about you, but when I think back on the examples that were shared earlier in the presentation, and social media posts and other things that I've seen and on the news and preparing for this presentation, I think that there's plenty of examples of violation of the code of ethics, but why is it happening now? Does it appear to be happening more frequently? Has it always been there? Maybe we're just more aware of it. So maybe these are not symptoms of the disease itself. Maybe what we're seeing is symptoms of the healing process, and we're hearing about it more because we're being more accountable and we're more aware. Maybe, but these are the questions we need to be asking ourselves. Because the bottom line is, the fact is that these stories, the news articles, and the social media posts, they're seen by the communities that we serve. Even when we get together as providers for coffee or for lunch or breakfast, or we're sitting around in a restaurant, or getting together at a local tavern to blow off steam, and we get together and we start talking, we have to remember that those stories that were being shared are heard by those around us. And the stories don't just stay there, right? It's not just us talking, it's not just us blowing off steam, it's not just a dark sense of humor. Sure, maybe part of it can be attributed to burnout. Maybe that's why there's anger and resentment, but it doesn't stay in those places. The fact is those news stories, those social media posts, those conversations, they don't stick around where they originated. They end up right here on every scene. And they can negatively impact the interaction with our peers, our fellow providers, the patient, their family, community. It can even have a negative impact before we even arrive, because the patient's seen the headlines and they call 911 and they're already fearful. So it can have an impact, knowingly or unknowingly. And as educators, folks, we're the gatekeepers to this profession. They don't enter the profession without coming through us. So we need to act as the gatekeepers, evaluating our initial education students and only allowing those that are deemed worthy to pass and join our beloved profession. Because look, as we've seen, there's already enough bad eggs in the system. And as educators, I suggest we need to embrace culling the herd. Not all that arrive are fit to serve. And it should be okay for us to have the conversation after performing objective evaluations that maybe this is not the industry for you. And limit the amount of jackassery that's going on in the profession. But it's not just initial education, right? Herd management never ends. So just like not all that arrive are fit to serve, not all those that are serving are fit to stay. And I'm not saying we have to exit everyone from the profession because they're having a bad day, because maybe we just need to help call attention to behaviors and provide opportunities to become better. And if they're just overt about it and don't want to address it and they're good with whatever, then maybe they do need to be exited from the industry. So part of our job as educators is on the CE side of the house, like continuing education. So we should be holding training sessions on the softer skills of EMS and identifying, specifically holding continuing education sessions specific to what we're seeing in the industry. So how do we do it? Where do we begin? Well, all this stuff deals with the breakdown of the affectual integrity, and we can't get into discussing the causes of those breakdowns. That's a much larger issue than a 1-hour webinar. But today we can at least talk about how we can identify the issues and then what we as educators can do to begin to address them. So let's just start with a affective domain. So I would argue that this is the most important domain of the 3 domains. So of course the cognitive domain deals with the head, right? And the knowledge, and psychomotor deals with the hands. And those are the 2 areas that we are most comfortable in because we can teach the cognitive stuff didactically and we can test the psychomotor stuff. But the affective domain, deals with heart, right? It deals with things like attitudes and values. And so it includes attitudes, awareness, attention, concern, interests, and responsibility. And when we talk about evaluating this domain, many people still argue that it's subjective. But I'd argue that this domain can be evaluated quite objectively just by the careful observation of behaviors and recording those behaviors as they are attributed to values, attitudes, concerns, etc. In initial education, we're used to evaluating the affective domain because it's required. It's something we have to evaluate. But I bet you that these evaluations are probably the most frequently pencil whipped evaluations out there. And I think that's because people don't want to have the difficult conversations. So we can perform affective evaluations based on student behavior in the classroom, during didactic time, during group work, during group activities. We can also create simulations utilizing scenarios developed specifically to evaluate for the student's affect. They should be evaluated during clinical and field experience and definitely during capstone, and they should be being evaluated by their preceptor, and they should also be evaluating their preceptor because it's all good data for us to look at. And when you take all that together, the picture that gets painted from all those different opportunities for evaluation provide us with a pretty good picture of the overall affect of the student. Ultimately, do you know that they give 2 hoots about what we're talking about? Is it possible that they could fake it till they make it? Arguably, yeah. We can't, we don't have an evaluation that's capable of reading thoughts or interpreting the heart. But if we observe for behaviors in carefully constructed environments and just in the wild, then we can get a pretty good idea of the student's affect, and then base the evaluation on that. So we can watch for behaviors, and that provides us with an objective means for evaluation, but it doesn't really provide us with a view to what's going on behind the behavior, right? Meaning we don't know what's driving it because we observe for behavior in the moment in a specific context, and that's not always transferable to all situations. And there's things that impact people's behaviors, and they may not even be aware of these things that impact their behaviors. And of course, that's bias. And if we're able to identify the root cause for the behavior, then that helps us understand the why behind the what. And that allows us to encourage a repeat of the good behavior while discouraging bad behavior from being repeated. So is there bias in EMS? Of course there is. Otherwise we wouldn't be having the conversation, right? There's actually bias in all areas of life, and bias in and of itself is not bad. It's what keeps you safe. But the real question we should be asking is there bias in EMS that negatively affects our patients, providers, students, agencies, the community? And I think the answer there is still yes. And when we talk about bias, most people go right here and they jump to explicit bias. If you try to have a conversation with a student or a provider about bias affecting behavior, they typically respond with, "I'm not racist." And to that, I respond with, "Awesome. I'm glad." But that's not what I'm talking about, because most people think of explicit bias when they think of bias. And so explicit is those that I choose. These are attitudes and beliefs held at a conscious level. So racial prejudice, discrimination, hate speech, and there's plenty of examples of that. Unfortunately, even in EMS, we see examples of that, especially in social media. But so, yeah, is there explicit bias in EMS? Yeah, there is, but explicit bias is usually very easy to identify, and then so it's very easy to take action against. And I think it's probably we're probably seeing it more now just because of how polarized our country has become, and people feel emboldened, and they feel safe saying whatever the heck it is they want to say. And so that's probably why we're seeing a little more of this. But more importantly, we should be evaluating and asking about implicit bias. And this is really what, when we try and get behind the what behind the behavior, the why behind the behavior, it's talking about this unconscious bias. It's outside of conscious awareness. We're not aware of it. It definitely can affect our behaviors. And basically, it's just a preference or aversion to a person or a group of people or what have you. So it's called implicit because it's done subconsciously. So maybe a better question to ask is, where is the bias in EMS, and what can we as EMS providers and educators do about it? It exists. It permeates all areas of the profession. Again, explicit bias is there, but it's usually very obvious, easily identified, so it's typically handled quite quickly, as we would expect it to be. And the tougher one would be the implicit bias, because by its very nature, it's not easily identified. But it's out there, and there's growing evidence to support it. And it's, again, we're having the conversations, there's studies being done. I am encouraged that we're working to identify it. And once it's identified, then we can do something about it. So there's studies being done that say, yes, there are disparities in care. And so this is just one example that was just looking at transport destinations within the same zip code that says that, hey, look, This one looked at about 865,000 events from just over 4,000 zip codes. And when compared against their white counterparts in the community, that people of color, Black patients and Hispanic patients, were more likely to be transported to safety net hospitals, not necessarily the closest or appropriate. And so there does appear to be some bias. This one was about pain management. And this one was out of Oregon. Around 25,000 patient care reports were reviewed. And the takeaway from this one was that when controlling for gender, age, location, insurance, and was a pain assessment done, when compared to white patients, Black, Hispanic, and Asian patients were less likely to receive pain medication from EMS for traumatic injuries. And so the study provides data, right? There's evidence that something is going on, and then it becomes part of what we need to do to dig into what's going on back, behind the scenes. So it's not just the studies being done. It's cool, and I'm excited to see that taking place, and that allows us to have conversations. But we need to be honest with ourselves too, and there's other clues to the existence of bias that are right in front of us, and we can see and we can actually hear bias in action just by listening to the stories being told. We're all guilty of telling war stories. And think about the war stories that you've shared, and be honest with yourself, or war stories that you've heard. And do any of those war stories contain terms like frequent flyer, drug seeker, crackhead, drunk, psych, crazy, attention seeker, system abuser, a ghetto? Those terms may not be being used when telling the stories to demonstrate an explicit bias, but they could be evidence of an underlying implicit bias. And by sharing stories using these terms, we are actually conditioning our students and those that we're having a conversation with to be accepting of those terms and the negative connotations or biases that come along with them. So as providers and educators, where can we do better? Well, how do you eat an elephant? Well, one bite at a time. And so we need to begin with ourselves. And there's surveys that you can take, and you can find them online. They're implicit bias surveys, and they just provide you with insight to any hidden unconscious bias that you may have with yourself, which means we need to be open to that investigation. We have got to want to get better. And so that we need to be open to receiving this feedback. And so you complete these, be honest in your self-evaluation, and remember what our goal is. And our goal is to improve our profession, but we have to start with ourselves. And then from there, where do we go? Well, we work within our area of comfort. And as educators, that's in our classrooms. So you do these surveys, and they identify implicit biases. And then there's tools like this implicit mnemonic that help you begin to mitigate the effects of those biases, because we all have bias. It's what do we do with it? How do we let it affect us and therefore our care? So there's techniques like introspection and mindfulness and perspective taking. Put yourself in someone else's shoes, literally from their point of view. What is the perspective? Slowing down, thinking of the individual instead of a group. So if you find yourself speaking of groups, there could be an indication of bias. That is, bring it down to it. an individual, they're not the group. Check our messaging and our stories. Institutionalized fairness. Maybe in our institutions, in our educational institutions, maybe there are entrance requirements that in and of themselves are creating a barrier that we need to take a look at. And then that last piece is take two. This is a never-ending process. It's not like, hey, I took a survey, I said I had bias here, I'm gonna be more mindful, I'm done. No, resisting implicit bias is a lifelong commitment. We have to remain committed to the process and to the work, and always be looking for ways to improve. So in our classrooms, we can work to improve the affectual integrity of our staff and students, and we should, ourselves, and then those around us, and then those people in our care. So we need to make sure that we are walking the walk, and that we hold our staff and students accountable to walk the walk and not just to talk the talk, and that we're all held to the same standard. So that means when we're doing frequent, and I mean frequent, affective evaluations on our students, maybe we should be having our students perform affective evaluations on us just as frequently. And that our peers, we should be peer evaluating one another and holding one another accountable, so that we can improve. And then we need to hold meetings with our fellow instructors to come together and discuss the data received. If we're just collecting data and doing nothing with it, then the data is worthless. We need to get together and we need to have the discussions about why are we seeing these things, this type of stuff, and what can we do about it, and learn from those. Look for trends, identify the trends, and then you know what? Then how about we design scenarios to be used in simulation to target those identified areas of weakness. So if we're identifying that, hey, you know, our students tend not to be real comfortable dealing with people that don't smell the best, then maybe we need more stinky patients in our classroom. All stuff that can be managed through simulation. So that means we have to educate. We have to educate our staff and our students on implicit bias. And not just let's talk about bias, but specifically implicit bias, and stress why it's important, how it can affect decisions and behaviors, provide implicit bias surveys and exercises to help the students and the staff and ourselves identify and begin to mitigate the impact, and create an environment where it's okay to say, where it's okay for us to hold one another accountable, and that it's all about a process of getting better, and that it's not an attack on the individual, it's an attack on the bias and the impact that's having on them. So what about with our clinical and field affiliates? We shouldn't overlook this area. Right, we work hard to prepare our students, and then we send them out, and sometimes they come back to us with some of the hard work undone. Right, so our students are sponges, and they absorb what they see. So that means maybe we need to be offering education opportunities to our clinical and field affiliates on the same stuff, on the affective domain, on implicit bias, on identifying bias, on mitigating bias. Maybe we should be holding meetings and offering training sessions to help them improve, share with them the evaluations that our students are filling out for them, so that they can work on themselves as well. But it's not, again, it's not enough just to have our students evaluate your preceptor, evaluate your clinical site, and then do nothing with it. But a lot of times that's what happens, because there's some tough conversations that may need to take place, and we need to get more comfortable with those conversations. And we're not recreating the wheel here. There are available resources to help us in these areas, and these are just some of the ones that I have found in the Idea for EMS committee with the National Registry. There are resources available on that site specific to diversity and inclusion, and we need to be seeking out these resources and using them because that will help us as we build out the process to identify and mitigate. So advancing professionalism. Well, you know what? It starts with us. That's where it starts. We need to be committed to the growth and advancement of professionalism for our industry. And we need to embrace change. We need to be change agents of change to carry us forward. It's not enough for us to say, this is the way we've always done it. This is how it was done to me. Therefore, this is how I do. And that's not good enough anymore. We need to walk the walk and not just talk. We just can't say, hey, we need to get better about this. We need to commit to increase responsibility, increase accountability, self-accountability, and accountability of our peers. Because we're talking about advancing professionalism. And I know that we can do better as a profession. I believe in us. I still love the profession. And I know we're better than the headlines, the news stories. We're better than the social media posts. In that we can restore the public opinion of EMS. We can regain their trust. And we don't get to decide when we wear the professionalism label. We need to assume we do and behave in such a manner. But you know what? The public, they're going to be the ones that let us know when we achieve our goal. And then they will refer to us as the professionals. So ultimately, I'll leave you with this. And this is just for me personally, that each day, my goal is to be better, to be a better person, a better provider, a better educator, a better dad, a better husband, better brother, just a better person than I was yesterday. And tonight when I go to bed, I'm going to go to bed with a dream of being better tomorrow than I was today. And I hope I've been able to plant a seed, and I hope that you are able to take some things away from our time together. And there's just some references from some material. And with that brings us to an end. If there's any questions, great. If you think of anything or you want to have a conversation, there's my email address. You can always reach me at spencer@platinumed.com, and I'm always happy to have a conversation, educator to educator.
Okay, there are a few questions. It looks like there's just 2 questions here, actually. Our first question is from Don, and he asks, why don't we as EMS educators get teaching certification through the local Department of Education? In Illinois, we need 1,000 hours of experience and 60 hours of college credit. I can now teach the EMR or EMT class to my son's high school, and kids are now having a professional license when applying to college. The student now has a job during college. What are your thoughts?
I think it's awesome when we can take what we do and meet the students where they're at. So I am a big fan and a big supporter of EMS education in the high school. I think we need to start conversations earlier than their junior or senior year, but I think that's great. And if you're having success with the high school programs and their licensing and they're working while they're going to college, that's awesome. The as far as why don't we as EMS educators get teaching certificates, right now there's not even a national standard for what an EMS educator is. It is state specific. Some states use the NAEMSE instructor courses, which are great courses, and the book that is used for those courses is an awesome resource. Foundations. I was struggling with coming up with a word, but the foundations. But in Michigan, EMS instructor is a separate license that we need to maintain beyond our provider license, and it's like that in some other states. But there are some areas where you're a provider, therefore you can teach, and you don't have to necessarily have any specific education on adult learners or any type of learning, honestly. So I agree that there should be some type of standard. I'm all for it. I think there should be some type of standard. I don't know that driving us all to EDD requirements. Do all EMS educators need to have a doctorate in education? That would be awesome, I guess. Or have a teaching certificate within the state that we're teaching in, maybe. I think those are great conversations that still need to take place.
All right. And the second question actually wasn't a question. Donna just referenced your slide on the code of ethics from the NAEMT site and said that there is a date of 2013. But other than
on my slide,
yes,
that needs to be updated then. Thank you, Donna.
All right, but that looks like that's all the questions we have.
So then I'll just leave you with thank you, Linda, for how can I forget? Thank you, Linda. I love my Linda. So, and then I'll just leave you with this. If, the symposium this year was great, and there was great conversations about this stuff. There was a pre-conference with Sahaj that was amazing. Artsia had a session on diversity and inclusion that was amazing, and I am encouraged that we're having the conversations, and I look forward to it. And you're educators, which means you have the ability to research and come up with ideas. And then maybe I'll have the opportunity to sit in on a webinar or sit on a session in person on your thoughts and ideas on it. And I look forward to that. So again, NAEMSE, thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for the platform. It's greatly appreciated. Of
course, John, and thank you so much for being willing to come and present a webinar for us today. I know that everybody greatly appreciated it. Everyone, I will make sure that I put John's contact info in the follow-up email tomorrow so you can follow up with him. And I put a link in the chat for the CEU registration, but I will also make sure I include that in tomorrow's follow-up email as well. And that brings us to a conclusion. So thank you, everybody, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.